If you are changing, why does the first thing you feel look like loneliness? That is the part almost no one explains. You were taught that real change would feel expansive, clear, and immediately recognizable. You would feel more connected, more certain, more aligned with where your life is going. But this phase does not arrive that way. It arrives quietly. It removes what used to feel familiar before it reveals what is true. And that strange distance you feel may not be regression at all. It may be misalignment becoming visible. What makes this feeling so confusing is that, on the surface, nothing may look dramatically different. The same people are still around you. The same places still exist. The same routines are still available to you. And yet, something in the way you meet them has already changed. This is why the loneliness feels strange. It is not always the loneliness of absence. It is often the loneliness of non-resonance. You are not necessarily cut off from life. You are not standing outside of everything. You are not suddenly unable to connect in any absolute sense. What is happening is more subtle than that. The patterns that once made you feel included, understood, emotionally synchronized, or internally settled are no longer producing the same experience inside you. And because the environment still looks familiar, the mind assumes the feeling must be wrong. But this is where most people misread the experience. They think loneliness only means there is no one there. They think it only appears when contact is missing, when distance is obvious, when disconnection can be seen clearly from the outside. But this phase does not always look like that. Sometimes you are still in the same conversations, still answering the same messages, still moving through the same spaces, and yet something no longer lands the way it used to. The emotional feedback is different. The internal response is different. The old familiarity is no longer translating into the same sense of belonging. And because that shift is internal before it is external, it creates a very specific kind of disorientation. You do not feel broken. You do not feel dramatic. You simply begin to notice that what once felt natural now feels slightly delayed, slightly muted, slightly out of alignment with the version of you that is beginning to emerge. That is why this phase can be so difficult to name. It does not announce itself loudly. It appears as a quiet mismatch. You may start to notice that certain forms of closeness no longer calm you in the same way. Certain interactions no longer feel false, but they no longer feel fully true either. Certain roles you use to move through automatically now require effort. And because none of this looks extreme, it is easy to dismiss. It is easy to tell yourself you are overthinking. It is easy to assume you are becoming distant for no reason. But the real shift is not always in the people around you. The real shift is in the structure through which you were relating to them. This is why the feeling can become even stronger in very ordinary moments. Not because anything is collapsing, but because the old form of coherence is no longer holding. You are still present, but not in the same way. You are still participating, but not with the same internal agreement. You are still there, but something in you is no longer being mirrored by what used to feel enough. And when that mirroring weakens, the mind often labels the gap as loneliness. But this loneliness is not always asking the same question people assume it is asking. It is not always asking, where is everyone? Sometimes it is asking, why does nothing fit the same way anymore? That is a completely different experience. Because the pain is not only about missing connection, it is about feeling the loss of correspondence between your inner state and the patterns that used to organize it. What hurts is not just emptiness. What hurts is misfit becoming conscious. And in this phase, that misfit can feel deeply personal even when it is structural. You may interpret it as failure. And you may interpret it as withdrawal. You may even interpret it as proof that something in you has become harder, colder, or more detached. But those conclusions often come too early, because what is changing first is not always your capacity to connect. Sometimes what is changing first is your capacity to keep pretending that the old forms of connection still reach you in the same way. That is why this feeling matters, not because it means you have lost your place, but because it reveals that your old place may no longer reflect your current state. And until that is understood clearly, you will keep trying to fix the feeling at the surface, without noticing that what feels like loneliness is sometimes the first sign that your inner world and your old rhythm are no longer the same. That is why it feels so unfamiliar. What makes this phase so difficult to recognize is that it rarely arrives in a form the mind has been trained to respect. Most people expect disconnection to look obvious. They expect something dramatic, something visible, something that clearly signals that a bond has broken or that life has become externally empty. But this experience does not usually begin that way. It does not arrive as a collapse. It arrives as a subtle loss of correspondence between your inner state and the patterns that once made you feel naturally connected. This is why the feeling is so easy to misread. You are not necessarily seeing your whole life fall apart. You are not waking up inside some clear emotional emergency. You are simply beginning to notice that things which used to land inside you with ease now feel slightly muted, slightly delayed, slightly out of sync. A conversation still happens, but it does not reach you in the same way. A familiar space still surrounds you, but it does not regulate you in the same way. An old rhythm is still available, but your system no longer enters it with the same internal agreement. And because the shift is so small at first, the mind does not call it transformation. It calls it fatigue, it calls it distance, it calls it indifference. Sometimes it even calls it failure. But what it is often registering is not a dramatic loss. It is a mismatch, becoming perceptible. It is not a breakdown. It is a blur. It is not a severing. It is a subtle loss of synchronization. This is where the distinction becomes important. Loneliness is not always the same thing as being socially isolated. When a person can feel lonely even while remaining in contact with other people, and a person can also be socially isolated in a more objective sense, with fewer social connections or interactions. Those are not identical experiences, and when they are confused, the internal reality gets misread, because what you may be feeling in this phase is not necessarily the external absence of people. It may be the subjective experience of disconnection happening inside a life that still looks socially intact from the outside. That is why this phase can be so disorienting. You look around and the visible structure may still be there. The messages still arrive. The routines still repeat. The familiar faces still exist. And because the external frame has not changed enough, you assume the feeling should not be there. So, you begin to question yourself instead. You assume you are becoming cold. You assume you are withdrawing for no reason. You assume something in you is malfunctioning. But what most people are actually experiencing is not emotional failure. It is an internal shift in what still feels real, nourishing, and coherent. And that shift rarely announces itself with intensity. It shows up as small moments that are easy to dismiss. You notice that certain conversations no longer touch the same place in you. You notice that being around people does not always remove the feeling of distance. You notice that your desire to be alone increases, but the solitude does not always feel peaceful either. So the experience becomes even more confusing, because it does not fit the categories the mind already knows. If you were simply alone, the explanation would feel easy. If you were simply connected, the discomfort would not be there. But this phase often exists in between those clear definitions. That is why people misread it so quickly. They think the discomfort means they are losing their ability to connect. They think the flatness means they are becoming emotionally unavailable. They think the mismatch means something is wrong with their personality, their relationships, or their direction. But the real issue is often more precise than that. The old forms of resonance are weakening before new forms of belonging have fully stabilized. And in that gap, the feeling does not look meaningful. It looks personal. It looks like a problem. It looks like something inside you has quietly gone wrong. But what is happening is often less absolute and more structural. And the external world may not have changed enough for the shift to be visible, yet your internal response has already begun to reorganize. So you remain in the same spaces, hearing the same words, meeting the same patterns, while noticing that the emotional match is no longer consistent. That is why the feeling can seem so irrational. Nothing dramatic happened, nothing clearly ended, and yet something no longer aligns with the same ease. So the real difficulty of this phase is not only the feeling itself, it is the way it disguises itself as something smaller, flatter, and easier to dismiss than it really is. Because once loneliness is understood only as visible absence, this quieter form becomes almost impossible to name, and when it cannot be named, it is usually misjudged. Not as a subtle loss of synchronicity, but as a flaw in who you are becoming. The reason this experience becomes so heavy is not only because of the feeling itself. It becomes heavy because of what the mind begins to conclude from the feeling. The loneliness appears first as a signal, but almost immediately it is turned into a judgment. And once that happens, the experience no longer remains simple. It becomes layered. You feel the distance, and then you begin interpreting the distance. You feel the mismatch, and then you begin deciding what the mismatch must mean about you. That second movement is what deepens the weight. The real problem is not the feeling. The real problem is the meaning attached to the feeling. Because a feeling, by itself, is something that can be noticed. It can be observed. It can be named with precision. But once the mind turns it into proof, the entire experience changes. It stops being something feels different. It becomes something is wrong with me, and that shift is what creates suffering that is often far greater than the original loneliness. This is why people often do not suffer only from the sense of disconnection. They suffer from the story that forms around it. They begin to think they are becoming emotionally unavailable. They think they are growing distant. They think they are failing at closeness, failing at belonging, failing at being the version of themselves that used to move through connection more easily. But what most people do not realize is that the first feeling and the meaning assigned to the feeling are not the same event. One is immediate, the other is interpretive. And once interpretation begins, reaction follows. When you start monitoring yourself more closely, you begin checking your responses in real time. You wonder why a conversation that used to feel effortless now feels like effort. You wonder why being around others does not automatically restore a sense of closeness. You wonder why you want more space, yet do not always feel peaceful inside that space. And because those changes do not feel easy to explain, the mind rushes toward a conclusion that feels emotionally coherent, even when it is not accurate. It says, "This must mean I am moving in the wrong direction." But that conclusion is often built too quickly. Feeling lonely does not automatically mean your life is empty in an external sense. And it does not automatically mean you are socially isolated in a concrete sense either. A person can still be in contact with others and feel lonely, because loneliness is a subjective experience. Social isolation is different. It refers more directly to reduced social contact or fewer social relationships. And when those two experiences are collapsed into one, the internal signal gets misread. You assume that because the feeling is real, the conclusion must also be real. But that is not always true. This is where the loop intensifies. The feeling appears. The interpretation forms. The reaction begins. And then the reaction starts reinforcing the interpretation. You pull back slightly because something feels off. Then you notice that withdrawal and use it as evidence that you are becoming disconnected. You become more self-conscious in your interactions. That self-consciousness makes connection feel less natural. Then the awkwardness is used as further proof that something in you is closing down. So the original feeling becomes surrounded by secondary tension, and that tension makes the entire experience heavier than it was at the beginning. What makes this even more difficult is that loneliness is a real human experience and not something that should be dismissed, denied, or romanticized. It matters. It affects how you perceive yourself, how you perceive others, and how you interpret the quality of your place within your life. But because it matters, it has to be read clearly, not exaggerated into fate, not turned into identity, not used as immediate proof that you are failing at connection. The feeling deserves attention. It does not deserve distortion, and this is the micro twist most people miss. What you are calling evidence that you are becoming separate may actually be evidence that older forms of belonging are no longer reaching you in the same way. What feels like personal failure may actually be structural change. What feels like emotional decline may simply be the moment when familiar patterns stop generating the same inner response they once did. That does not make the loneliness unreal. It makes the interpretation less certain. So the weight of this phase is not created only by the distance you feel. It is created by the speed with which the mind turns that distance into a verdict. It says you are becoming strange. It says you are becoming selfish. It says you are becoming someone who no longer knows how to connect. But the feeling itself does not say any of that. And the feeling only says that something is no longer landing the same way. Everything after that is meaning. And meaning, when attached too quickly, is what turns discomfort into self-accusation. What most people do not realize is that belonging is not only social, it is also rhythmic. It is shaped by the timing of your attention, the pace of your responses, the patterns through which your inner state meets the world around you. And when that rhythm begins to change, even slightly, the places, conversations, and forms of contact that once felt natural can begin to feel different without anything clearly breaking on the outside. This is why a person can remain surrounded by the same life and still begin to feel a quiet form of displacement. The people may still be there. The routines may still exist. When the structures of contact may still remain intact, but the internal timing through which those structures once felt supportive is no longer moving in the same way. So the change does not always begin as loss. It often begins as altered correspondence. The old rhythm continues, but something in you is no longer entering it with the same ease. And because the external form has not disappeared, the feeling can become difficult to interpret. You are not looking at an obvious ending. You are not facing a dramatic absence that explains itself immediately. You are standing inside familiar conditions, noticing that familiar conditions no longer regulate you in the same way. What once created comfort now creates neutrality. What once created neutrality now creates strain. What once felt like belonging now feels like maintenance. And that is where the confusion deepens. Most people think belonging is only about who is around them. They think if contact still exists, then the sense of connection should remain stable. But that is not always how the experience unfolds. A person can still have social contact and still feel lonely, because loneliness is not identical to objective social isolation. Those are not the same condition. One describes a subjective experience. The other refers more directly to the absence or reduction of social connection itself. And when that distinction is not understood, every internal change gets interpreted through an external lens that is too narrow to explain it. This is where the old rhythm and the emerging self begin to create tension. The old rhythm is still available. It still offers its familiar forms, its familiar timing, or its familiar expectations of how closeness should feel and how presence should function. But the emerging self no longer receives those forms in exactly the same way. Not because they are inherently wrong, not because everyone around you has suddenly become misaligned, but because the structure that once held you is no longer holding you with the same precision. The fit is changing. And when the fit changes, belonging changes with it. That does not mean every personal change leads to loneliness. It does not mean every shift in priorities must create distance. But it does mean that there are phases in which the internal rhythm begins to reorganize before the outer form of life reorganizes with it. And during those phases, the person can feel strangely out of place inside circumstances that still look completely recognizable. That is why this experience can be so unsettling. It is not only social, it is structural. It is not only about who is present, it is also about what still resonates. This is why external contact and internal mismatch can exist at the same time. You can still answer, still participate, still show up, still move through familiar environments, and yet feel that something is no longer settling inside you in the way it once did. The contact is there, but the coherence is weaker. The form remains, but the emotional agreement has shifted. And when that happens, the mind often looks outward for an explanation, because it has not yet learned to recognize that belonging can change from the inside first. What makes this phase so delicate is that it can easily be mistaken for emotional failure, like when it is often an indication that your relationship to familiarity is changing. The old rhythm still knows how to repeat itself. It still knows how to offer the same cues, the same patterns, the same routes into predictability. But predictability and belonging are not always the same thing. A pattern can remain familiar long after it has stopped feeling deeply supportive. And once that difference becomes conscious, the experience of being in your life begins to change in quiet but significant ways. So the strange feeling is not always a sign that something has gone wrong. Sometimes it is a sign that the structure which once gave you a stable sense of place is no longer matching the rhythm you are moving into. The external world may not have changed enough to confirm that yet. The visible forms may still look the same. But the inner timing is different now, and when inner timing changes, belonging does not disappear all at once. It begins to reorganize. The silence is not always the danger. Sometimes the danger is staying silent inside it, because a feeling can remain manageable while it is being recognized. But once it is ignored, minimized, romanticized, or treated as something too vague to matter, it begins to settle more deeply into the structure of daily life. And when that happens, the issue is no longer only that you feel disconnected. The issue is that the disconnection is no longer being seen clearly enough to be understood for what it is. This is where the conversation has to become more grounded, because loneliness is not just a poetic state. It is not just a symbolic phase. And it is not something that should automatically be turned into mystery simply because it feels difficult to explain. Loneliness and social isolation are associated with both mental and physical health. That matters. It means this experience should not be dismissed as if it were only an abstract emotional weather pattern passing through. It deserves attention precisely because it is real. And this is where people often make a subtle but costly mistake. They begin by misreading the feeling, and then they continue by not taking it seriously enough. They tell themselves it is just a phase, just sensitivity, just tiredness, just overthinking, just a passing reaction to change. But the problem is not only the presence of the feeling. The problem is what happens when the feeling is allowed to continue without recognition, language, gain or honest contact with reality. Because what is unnamed is often unmanaged. That does not mean every period of loneliness carries the same weight, and it does not mean every inner shift should be interpreted through fear. But it does mean the experience should not be romanticized into something automatically meaningful, just because it arrives during a period of personal change. A person can be changing and still need to take loneliness seriously. A person can be reorienting their life and still need to recognize that prolonged disconnection is not something to glorify. Depth is not the same as health. Withdrawal is not the same as wisdom. Silence is not always insight. This is why clarity matters so much in this phase. If the feeling is understood only as a sign of transformation, then its human reality can disappear behind the interpretation. You stop asking whether you are actually feeling cut off for too long. You stop asking whether your sense of connection is eroding in a way that deserves care. You stop asking whether the loneliness is becoming part of your baseline. And that is when a reflective experience begins to harden into a pattern that quietly shapes perception, energy, and well-being from underneath. The point is not to create alarm, the point is to restore proportion. Because the same experience can be approached in two very different ways. In one, loneliness is noticed clearly, named honestly, and held with responsibility. In the other, it is blurred into philosophy, hidden behind identity, or tolerated so long that it begins to define the emotional atmosphere of everyday life. And those are not the same path. One creates awareness. The other creates drift. What makes this especially important is that loneliness and social isolation are not merely concepts. They are experiences with real health significance. So when someone is moving through a period of personal change and begins to feel persistently detached, the most grounded response is not to dramatize it, but it is also not to dismiss it. It is to see it clearly, to recognize that the feeling may have meaning, but it also has consequences if it remains prolonged and unaddressed. The feeling does not need to be feared. It needs to be understood without distortion. That is the balance this phase requires. Not denial, not exaggeration, not mystification. The inner experience may still be subtle, but subtle does not mean insignificant. Quiet does not mean harmless, and private does not mean unreal. If loneliness or disconnection continues, it should not be treated as some elegant proof that you are evolving beyond ordinary life. It should be met with honesty, because what becomes dangerous is not only the distance itself, it is the habit of living inside that distance without naming it, without responding to it, and without admitting that something real may need care. It does not feel like going backward. It feels like restoring comfort. That is why this phase is deceptive. When loneliness becomes difficult to hold, most people do not experience the urge to return as a conscious rejection of growth. They experience it as relief. They experience it as a movement back toward what once felt easy and emotionally predictable. And because that movement feels soothing in the moment, it is rarely questioned. This is the reaction that appears in silence. A person begins to feel the tension of no longer fitting the same way, and instead of staying with that tension long enough to understand it, they start adjusting themselves back toward familiarity. They return to the tone that used to make others comfortable. They return to the rhythm that used to create approval. They return to patterns of availability and emotional positioning that once helped them move through connection without friction. But what they are often returning to is not deeper truth. It is easier predictability. That is why the reversal can be hard to see. It does not announce itself as self-abandonment. It feels like becoming normal again. It feels like softening the distance. And it feels like reducing the tension. And because the discomfort of misalignment has become difficult to tolerate, the self begins to interpret the familiar as safe and the unfamiliar as wrong. But familiar and aligned are not always the same thing. This is where the mistake becomes powerful. A person confuses what is known with what is true. They confuse what once worked with what still fits. They confuse what once generated smooth contact with what now creates real belonging. And when those things are confused, they do not simply reconnect. They begin reshaping themselves to match patterns that no longer reflect the person they are becoming. Not because they are weak, but because familiar discomfort is easier to tolerate than unfamiliar space. That is why the return feels convincing. It carries the emotional texture of certainty. It reduces internal ambiguity. It offers immediate social readability. The old version of you knew how to move in certain environments without needing to pause or question whether your inner state was truly present. It knew how to respond in ways that were legible and quickly reinforced. So when the newer rhythm begins to make old interactions feel strained, the temptation is not to betray yourself. The temptation is to stop feeling so uncertain. And that is a very different mechanism. What makes this stage intense is that the mind often interprets relief as evidence. If going back feels easier, it assumes going back must be right. If the old pattern restores immediate smoothness, it assumes the smoothness must be real connection. But smoothness is not always connection. Ease is not always alignment. Sometimes ease is simply the removal of friction that was forcing you to notice how much of your old belonging depended on repetition rather than resonance. That is why returning can feel stabilizing while quietly recreating the mismatch you were starting to perceive. And this is where the stakes become clear. The person does not only move back toward old relationships or old social dynamics, they move back toward old internal agreements. They begin speaking from an earlier version of themselves. They begin editing their responses to preserve familiarity. They begin rewarding themselves for being easier to receive rather than more truthful to inhabit. And little by little, the original feeling that something had changed gets covered over by the temporary comfort of fitting again. But fitting again is not the same as being met. This is why so many people misread this stage. They think the urge to return proves that the newer state was never real. They think the longing for old ease proves that the old version was more authentic. But what it often proves is much simpler. The old pattern was easier to predict. It asked less of your awareness. And when loneliness enters the process, quick reinforcement becomes seductive. So the danger here is not only the discomfort of feeling out of place. The danger is how quickly that discomfort can train you to negotiate with yourself, to become slightly smaller again, slightly clearer to others at the cost of being less clear to yourself, slightly more harmonious on the surface while becoming more divided underneath. And because that division reduces external friction, it can look like healing. But what it is often restoring is not connection. It is compliance with what once felt easier to survive. The shift begins when you stop asking the wrong question, because the question, "Why do I feel so disconnected?" often keeps the attention trapped inside the feeling itself. It keeps the mind circling the discomfort as if the discomfort were the whole reality. But this is where the orientation has to change. The more useful question is not, "Why is this happening to me?" The more useful question is what no longer feels like a true place of belonging in the way it once did. That question does not deny the feeling. It gives the feeling somewhere clearer to point. This matters because once loneliness is felt, people usually move in one of three directions. They react to it immediately, they romanticize it, or they dismiss it. And none of those responses creates real clarity. Immediate reaction turns the feeling into behavior before it has been understood. Romanticizing it turns the feeling into identity before it has been measured against reality. Dismissing it pushes it underground, where it continues shaping the inner atmosphere without language or awareness. So the first shift is not external, it is perceptual. The feeling is not the instruction, the feeling is the signal. That is the distinction that changes everything. Because a signal is something to read, not something to obey automatically. It does not tell you to leave your life. It does not tell you to cut people off. It does not tell you that every form of contact is false or that every old structure must be abandoned. When it tells you that something about the way belonging is currently organized inside you is changing, and that change deserves careful attention rather than instant action. This is where the experience becomes more grounded. Loneliness is a real experience, and social isolation is real as well, but they are not identical. A person can feel lonely while still having contact with others, and social isolation can involve a more objective reduction in social connection. That means the correct response is not to turn every feeling of distance into a dramatic narrative, but it is also not to ignore it as if it has no significance. Both loneliness and social isolation matter because they are associated with health and well-being. So the point is not to glorify the experience. The point is to recognize it clearly. That recognition creates stability, not because the feeling vanishes immediately, but because it stops controlling the meaning of everything around it. Once you understand that the signal is pointing toward a change in your sense of belonging, you no longer need to interpret every moment of discomfort as proof that you are lost. You also no longer need to make the opposite mistake of treating the discomfort as some sacred sign that everything in your life is wrong. Both extremes distort the signal. One denies it, the other exaggerates it. So the deeper movement here is not to ask how to escape the feeling as quickly as possible. It is to ask what the feeling is revealing about your current relationship to familiarity, contact, and internal fit. What no longer feels nourishing in the same way, or in what no longer creates the same internal coherence. What still exists in form, but no longer feels fully inhabited. That kind of question slows the mind down. It interrupts the reflex to dramatize. It interrupts the reflex to numb. And that interruption is where maturity begins. Because once the feeling is observed instead of obeyed, a different kind of stability becomes possible. You can acknowledge that loneliness deserves seriousness without letting it become fate. You can recognize that prolonged disconnection should not be ignored without turning it into a grand myth about your identity. You can let the experience remain human, specific, honest. And this is what prevents the state from becoming either sentimental or invisible. It is seen but not worshipped. It is respected but not exaggerated. That is the real reframe. And you do not need to ask, why am I becoming someone who no longer belongs anywhere? And you need to ask, what kind of belonging is no longer coherent with the life forming inside me? That question is quieter, but it is more accurate. And accuracy creates steadiness. Because once you stop treating the feeling as a command, you can begin reading it as information, not a verdict, not a prophecy, not an excuse to disappear. Just a signal that something old in your sense of belonging may be changing, and that it needs to be seen clearly before it is interpreted. When this phase begins to resolve, it usually does not resolve in the way people expect. There is no dramatic moment where the loneliness disappears and everything suddenly becomes clear. And there is no sharp emotional breakthrough that arrives and announces that you have finally moved beyond it. What changes is quieter than that. The feeling does not always vanish. It simply loses its authority. It stops speaking with the same power. It stops defining what everything means. Before, the feeling was shaping your interpretation of yourself. Now it begins to inform your awareness without controlling it. That distinction matters. Because when loneliness still has the power to define you, every moment of distance feels personal. Every silence feels loaded. Every mismatch feels like evidence that something essential is wrong. But once the experience is being read more clearly, the same feeling no longer forces the same conclusion. It may still appear, but it does not automatically become identity. This is the change most people miss because they are looking for intensity. They are looking for a visible turning point. They are looking for a dramatic confirmation that the phase has ended. But what actually happens is more stable and less theatrical. The internal question begins to change. Before, the mind kept asking, what is wrong with me? Now it begins asking, what is no longer true for me in the same way it once was? That is a very different orientation. One creates self-suspicion, the other creates discernment. And because that shift is quieter, many people do not recognize it at first. They assume that if loneliness still appears sometimes, then nothing has changed. But that is not necessarily accurate. The real sign of movement is not that the feeling never returns. The real sign of movement is that when it returns, it no longer governs your direction. Before, you were trying to escape it. Now you can read it. Before, it defined your decisions. Now it only informs your awareness. Before, it made you question your worth. Now it helps you notice where coherence is weaker and where truth is stronger. This is why the resolution feels more like stabilization than release. Your life may still look externally similar in many ways. Not every structure changes overnight. Not every form of belonging reorganizes at once. But internally, something becomes less reactive. The old urgency begins to loosen. The need to translate every uncomfortable feeling into a verdict begins to fade. And in that quieter space, you become more capable of distinguishing between a passing emotional state and a real signal about what still fits your life. That does not mean loneliness is always a positive sign, and it does not mean it should ever be treated carelessly. It remains a real experience, and both loneliness and social isolation still matter in relation to health and well-being. So the point is not to glorify the feeling after the fact. The point is to recognize that one possible form of progress is not the complete disappearance of discomfort, but the loss of its power to define who you are. That is a more grounded kind of change, because once the feeling loses that authority, you stop negotiating with yourself in the same way. You do not rush to prove that you are still easy to receive. You do not immediately collapse back into old patterns just to erase uncertainty. You do not treat every trace of distance as proof of failure. Instead, you begin to relate to the experience with more precision. You can feel it without becoming it. You can notice it without obeying it. You can take it seriously without surrendering your entire identity to it. And that is where stability begins. So the real shift is not that loneliness disappears like a storm leaving the sky. The real shift is that it becomes smaller than your awareness. It becomes one part of your experience instead of the lens through which all experience is interpreted. And when that happens, something very subtle but very important changes. You are no longer asking the feeling to tell you who you are. You are using it to understand what is and is not aligned in the life you are now living. That is why the ending is quiet. The feeling may still visit, but it no longer gets to narrate you. That is not perfect peace, and it is something steadier. It is the moment your inner life stops being ruled by misinterpretation and starts being guided by clearer recognition at last. So this is what this phase was really asking of you, not to panic when the old sense of belonging weakened, not to worship the loneliness as if it were automatically meaningful, not to run from it, and not to build an identity around it, only to read it more clearly. Because the strange loneliness that can appear after a period of inner change is not always proof that you are moving in the wrong direction. Sometimes it is simply the moment when what used to hold you no longer holds you in the same way. That does not make the feeling imaginary. It does not make it harmless. Loneliness is still something that deserves to be taken seriously, and social isolation matters as well. And that is exactly why the feeling has to be met with honesty instead of fantasy. If you romanticize it, you stop seeing it clearly. If you ignore it, you stop responding to it clearly. And if you fear it too quickly, you let it define more than it actually should. So the real task was never to glorify the feeling or to erase it on command. The real task was to understand what it was pointing to. Because once you do that, the experience changes. The loneliness stops acting like a verdict and starts functioning more like information. It no longer tells you who you are. It shows you what no longer fits with the same coherence as before. It shows you where familiarity has remained, but inner agreement has weakened. It shows you where you are still trying to be supported by forms that no longer reach you in the same way. And that is a very different kind of knowledge. Not dramatic, not explosive, but stabilizing. This is why the ending of this process is so quiet. You do not suddenly become someone who never feels distance again. You become someone who is no longer ruled by what the distance seems to imply. You stop asking the feeling to give you an identity. You stop using it as proof that you are broken, cold, lost, or moving backward. Instead, you begin to see it for what it is, a signal that asks for precision, not panic, attention, not mythology, honesty, not performance. So if you are in this phase right now, do not ask yourself only how to make the feeling disappear. Ask yourself what it is revealing about what no longer feels true, nourishing, or internally aligned in the same way it once did. That question is quieter, but it is also more accurate. And sometimes accuracy is what brings the deepest form of relief. If you are in this phase, comment, "I'm learning what no longer fits." And if you want more videos that help you read inner change clearly without turning it into fear or fantasy, follow Quantum Secrets. Because the goal was never to become someone who never feels uncertainty. It was to become someone who can understand it without being defined by it. What once felt like support may now feel like habit. What once felt like connection may now feel like maintenance. What once felt like certainty may now feel like repetition. And noticing that difference does not mean you are abandoning life. It means you are becoming more precise about the forms of belonging that still carry truth for you. That precision is not withdrawal, it is discernment. And it is the point where your inner life becomes clear enough to stop confusing comfort with alignment and familiar structure with real sustenance. And that is where the confusion finally begins to loosen.